Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this video kindly sponsored by REC Watches. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of the SR71. Here's the one surviving original trainer. And, well, where is it now? Well, it's in a museum, but over the course of its lifetime, it went through quite a lot of spare parts, as you imagine anything tearing around the sky at Mach 3 probably does. And one of those consumable parts are the titanium so-called turkey feathers that help to direct and collimate the thrust from those two massive engines. REC managed to get a hold of a bunch of them that had been sold out of service, and now they've incorporated them into a line of watches called the Habu watches, as Habu was the nickname for the SR71 when it was based over in the Western Pacific. So each Habu watch contains a small part of an actual SR71 that actually flew, and in some ways is actually even more unique than if you got a bit from an operational SR71 reconnaissance aircraft, because as I said, the SR71B, well, they only built two, one crashed, and so this is a literal one-of-a-kind aircraft. If you go to the link in the video description below and use the code DRAC, you can get a nice discount off the price of a Habu watch. But this week you'll also notice a second link, because if you think that the Habu watch is perhaps a little bit too dear for your tastes at the moment, you could potentially check out some of their other watches. The discount code will work there as well, and you'll find that some of the other watches they do are made from other interesting vehicles. If you like cars, there's one using bits from a Ford GT40, and there's another one based on a Formula One car, like this one here. And REC are working on new releases all the time, so if you want, you could just sign up for the launch list and they'll let you know about upcoming releases if you want to see what machine they're going to turn into a watch next. So thanks to REC for sponsoring this video, and now on with the main section. Royalty and navies have a somewhat mixed relationship. While many royals in various royal families would serve at various levels within their navies at early stages of their lives, once reigning as king, emperor, or whatever other title they adopted, a lot of royals tended to like using a navy to further their goals, but relatively few seemed willing to actually fund said navy to the point that it was actually capable of effectively doing what they wanted it to. This, coupled with the fact that for much of the almost 1,000 years between the emergence of the various feudal states of Europe and the end of the Age of Sail, the distinction between warship and merchant ship with a lot of guns was a bit blurred, meant that overall the navies, as we would understand them today, were actually quite small and somewhat temporary things for quite a while, with much exploration and advancement in ship design being left to individuals, occasionally with some royal subsidy or other thrown in. Now, of course, there were exceptions to this, and one of the more notable exceptions, albeit one who doesn't get as much mention in the 21st century as perhaps he deserves, is today's subject, Prince Henry of Portugal, known by some as Henry the Navigator. Now, much has actually been written over time about Henry, although much of that has depended on what agenda the author themselves was trying to advance, and so today we're going to take a brief look at what can definitely be confirmed about him and his important role at the start of the European Age of Exploration. Given that this is about 50 years of his adult life, it is necessarily a high-level review. Henry was born in 1394, the fifth child and, more importantly, third surviving child of King John I of Portugal and Philippa of Lancaster. His father had been the winner of a short but vicious struggle about a decade earlier that had seen one of many attempts over the centuries to absorb Portugal into a wider Iberian kingdom, although in this case, since the unification of Spain was itself still about a century in the future, it was more properly an attempt to unite the kingdom of Castile with Portugal, with Castile being the preeminent one of the two. That particular conflict had included the Battle of Aljubarrota, which would in several hundred years' time be the root cause of Britain being granted access to the Azores in World War II to fight German U-boats, but that's a story for another time. John's marriage to the daughter of John of Gaunt, brother of the King of England, had certainly strengthened his position, although amusingly it has meant that through the centuries various historians have tried to retroactively adopt Prince Henry as an honorary Englishman due to the connection between England and the sea, and as we'll discover, Henry's own connections with the watery realm. He seems to owe his relatively un-Portuguese name to his parents alternating their children's names between English and Portuguese, although there would always be a Portuguese equivalent for obvious reasons. Their first and third children had been named Blanche, or Blanca, in Portuguese, and Edward, or Duarte, respectively, while children number 2 and 4 had been the more traditional Afonso and Pedro. The trend would continue after Henry, who, as an odd-numbered child, had an English name, with Isabella, then John, and then Fernando. Blanche, or Blanca, died before she was even a year old, and Afonso died when Henry was about 6, which left him as the third son behind his 2 surviving older brothers. After his birth and baptism, the historical record goes quite silent until his mid-teens, toward the end of the 1400s and the start of the 1410s. As he grew up and received a royal education, it seems he showed a particular interest and gained a good degree of knowledge in a number of related fields, including astronomy, navigation, map-making, and what passed at the time for the science of shipbuilding, alongside various other known interests such as theology. He also adopted as his personal motto, talent de bien faire, or a hunger to perform worthy deeds, and it was clear from early in his career at court that he intended to make his own mark on the world far beyond that which a third son would normally be expected to make. Whether this was going to be as a crusader or by some other method, Henry was determined to be an active part of Portuguese and European development. In 1415, at the age of 21, he also proved himself to be quite an astute politician. While his cousin, King Henry V of England, was beating the stuffing out of the French at Agincourt, Henry of Portugal announced himself to be the protector of the rights and privileges of the Portuguese nobility. In previous times, a king with a Plantagenet son who was so closely aligned with the nobles could expect a rather swift rebellion and civil war in the near future, but instead it seems that Henry had entered this arrangement with the idea of at least appearing to be on the nobles' side, and thus being able to largely direct their ire at various reforms elsewhere, which actually meant that they broadly stayed on side with the crown for the duration. Also in that year, a huge fleet set out from Lisbon to the somewhat confused bewilderment of the rest of Europe. Quite where Portugal thought it was going with 100 large ships loaded with men, horses, supplies, and siege engines was something of a mystery. Indeed, King John had actually run out of suitable and available Portuguese ships when putting the fleet together, and so had chartered almost any large hull that happened to show up in Portuguese ports over the past few months. At the head of a large squadron of royal galleys and some of the troop transports was Prince Henry, while a total of almost 20,000 troops in total sat aboard the fleet. The confusion that everyone felt was because, having signed a peace treaty with Castile some years earlier, Portugal didn't seem to actually have any ongoing enemies worthy of such an expedition, and thus a number of smaller European powers quietly began reinforcing their castles and ports just in case. Even the Kingdom of Aragon was concerned, having received a report that the Portuguese intended to enact an immensely complex plan that involved somehow invading Castile, despite the fact they had a land border with it. At the time, Castile was under a co-regency which included King Fernando of Aragon, and then, with reinforcements from their former enemy, they would march to crush and take the Kingdom of Granada, the last major holdout of Moorish control on the Iberian Peninsula, thus creating a gigantic Portuguese Pac-Man that, in a rather amusing turnabout of events for students of history, might then look to absorb Aragon and result in a Portuguese-dominated Iberian Peninsula. In fact, the original idea had been to go after some portion of Granada, but since this would have annoyed both Aragon, which, as we said, had the part of the co-regency over Castile, And Castile, although they were less sensitive to the feelings of the Castilians, who claimed dominion over Granada, even if it would take a few more decades to actually get around to reconquering it, the Portuguese had instead decided to just go elsewhere. As it turned out, young Henry was in fact proclaiming a crusade against the Islamic State, occupying what is roughly today known as Morocco. More specifically, he was targeting Ceuta, a city which sits opposite Gibraltar at the entrance to the Mediterranean. At the time, both Ceuta and Gibraltar were under Islamic control, but under the control of two different kingdoms. The Nasrids controlled Gibraltar on the European side, and the Marinids on the African side controlled Ceuta. Ceuta, or Sabta, as the current occupants called it at the time, was heavily fortified and served as mainly as a base for corsairs who happened to be raiding the shipping of anyone passing into or out of the Mediterranean who hadn't paid sufficient tribute as protection money. But it was so far down the possible list of perceived targets for the Portuguese expedition that the rulers of the place took no particular defensive preparations when they heard of the fleet sailing. From Henry's perspective, though, it was an excellent target to demonstrate his prowess, and, on a grand strategy level, Ceuta was also the main conduit for reinforcements whenever one of the Catholic Iberian kingdoms launched an attack on Granada. If Henry had ambitions to take Granada at some point, cutting off its supply line was a good first step. The fact it was also a rich trading port, not just for east-west traffic that wasn't menaced by corsairs, but it also served as the northern terminus of north-south trade over the Sahara, also helped. For cash-strapped Portugal, such a steady inflow of wealth would be most welcome, assuming the garrison costs didn't exceed the trade income. Doubly so, as the cost of outfitting the expedition had seen the Crown essentially mortgage every aspect of Portugal they could leverage into cold hard cash, so if the whole thing failed, they were on the hook for a lot of money. I mean, they were on the hook for a lot of money either way, but at least if they won, they could loot the place. At first, it seemed the expedition might be over before it began. Plague swept through Lisbon, which took Queen Philippa among its many victims. There was also a solar eclipse, which was held to be an ill omen, and then the fleet spent a week becalmed off the Algarve. Finally, when they eventually reached their target in August, the galleys made for the harbour, but the troop and supply ships were swept by the currents and winds in the Straits of Gibraltar, off in the direction of Malaga, and not for a holiday. While they were waiting for the army's return, the galleys obviously rather ruined the element of surprise, and then to cap it all off when the sailing ships eventually showed up, a massive storm forced the whole fleet to have to dash over to a nearby Castilian port to take shelter. But it seemed that, in fact, all these occurrences had exhausted the Portuguese supply of bad luck, and in actual fact the delay had allowed the royals, the king and his princes alike, to conduct a survey of the fortifications of Ceuta and pick out various weaknesses, something they were all quite experienced in doing after decades of war with Castile. And thus, on the 21st of August 1415, the fleet made its way back to Ceuta and launched a single massive assault. The Moroccans made a huge mistake in sallying out their garrison to try and defeat the attack on the beaches before it could get siege weapons ashore, only to end up having most of their garrison wiped out by an onrushing tide of heavily armoured men who were fired up by equal parts religious fanaticism to kill the infidel, and a very deep and lasting desire not to be on a storm-tossed ship for any minute longer than was absolutely necessary. Aided by a bombardment of cannon, which Henry had supposedly ingeniously managed to attach to the bows of several Portuguese ships, the attacking troops quickly swarmed into Ceuta, capturing it in less than a day. Henry himself appears to have declared the Portuguese version of Leroy Jenkins and vanished ahead of his contingent through a broken gate, something that actually caused more trouble than it was probably worth, as a number of his personal retinue were then killed trying to fight their way through to where he'd managed to get himself surrounded and cut off from other assistance in his one-man war against the entire garrison. But with the city eventually overrun, the army settled in for a good long session of looting, as was the style at the time, and once almost anything of worth had been seized or accidentally destroyed, it was announced that the city was being formally annexed into Portugal, although most of its current population had already fled and much of the rest were due to be expelled, as it was considered easier to repopulate the city with Christian settlers than to try and exert control over a city that would otherwise be both surrounded by and majority populated by Muslims, on the rather understandable assumption that such a population would almost certainly betray the city to any attacking army from Morocco. Henry then led a faction of Portuguese nobles in trying to build this success into momentum to retake the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula from the remaining Islamic rulers of Granada, but this scheme collapsed partially because Aragon and Castile were then suffering from political instability and weren't really in a position to launch a crusade, partly because those same kingdoms were actually at this point enjoying relatively good relationships with the Moorish kingdoms and actually sent a bunch of letters swearing that they had nothing to do with this expedition, and partially because, in their opinion, letting the Portuguese have any kind of hand in retaking what they saw as their backyard was pretty much near anathema to them. The next year, although there was an experienced commander actually in place as governor, Henry was made ultimately responsible for both the supply and defence of Ceuta, which actually worked out quite well, as the distant outpost could now enjoy both a veteran soldier in charge at the actual front line, but also a powerful, high-ranked and motivated benefactor back on the mainland, who would occasionally visit, quote-unquote, his domain with the supply fleets. This responsibility would lay the groundwork for Henry's first major contribution to the maritime world proper. Ceuta needed regular resupply. Understandably, the Moroccans weren't really in a mood to trade with them for anything, really. But although there were large cargo ships available that could carry the requisite food and goods required, they were all traditional medieval square-rigged ships and quite incapable of sailing against the wind, something which the invasion fleet had encountered and would turn out to be a significant problem if you were going to spend any real amount of time in the Straits of Gibraltar, since they were subject to notoriously ever-shifting winds. On the other hand, there was a type of ship available that could far more easily transit the Straits, the Caravel, a small craft at the time with 1 or 2 masts equipped with fore and aft triangular lateen sails. The only real problem was their small size and capacity, as at the time they were mostly coastal trade and fishing craft of, barely over 10 tons displacement. Many, many more of them would thus be needed to keep the supply routes open as compared to the big cargo ships, unless of course some way could be found to make them larger. And so, under Henry's guidance, the Caravella Tilhada, the slightly larger of the 2 forms of caravel available to them at the time, or one that actually had a full deck, began to grow somewhat, reaching an average displacement of 40 to 50 tons, with some examples even topping 100 tons, and normally acquiring a 3rd mast as well as a crew of around 20. Now, while a ship of around 20 men and 50 to 150 tons might sound quite small to modern ears, and indeed even back then they weren't exactly the largest ships, what they were was fast, agile, and able to sail against the wind, utilizing roughly 300 degrees of the compass with only a 60-degree arc, 30 degrees to either side of the direction of the wind, denied to them, with tacking made relatively easy by the unfixed nature of the yard, and thus the ability to sweep the sail back and forth across the wind, somewhat independent of where the hull was actually pointing. This did mean that the ship could not carry a raised forecastle, as the sail needed the space to transit, which made it marginally less capable in a fight in the traditional form of ships sailing up to one another and engaging in land warfare, with additional risk of Piscavorian visitation. But Henry would also pioneer experiments to thus equip his caravels with multiple cannon of various types. Not too many, on account of their overall still small size, and the increased number of expensive trained gun crews that this would entail, but some caravels would carry 4, 6, or even 10 guns, and the upper end of this certainly wouldn't be unheard of by the time the type had matured under his guidance and subsequent to his lifespan. These rather innovative craft would, as mentioned, start life as attempts to make the Ceuta supply run somewhat less fragmented and expensive, since a handful of 40 to 60-ton caravels could carry far more supplies at far less expense than a whole flotilla of open-decked 10 to 20-ton fishing versions, and they would later prove highly useful in various voyages of exploration. Even after Henry's lifetime, a further evolved form would establish itself. Still larger, and equipped with a single square-rigged mast for more general sailing, the various caravel forms would prove highly useful on a great variety of exploration missions, including that of Columbus at the other end of the 1400s, even if as a dedicated combat craft the larger carracks and then galleons would supplant them as the 1400s went on. In the late 1410s, Henry, now frustrated in his attempts to lead the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, decided instead to begin assembling a large collection of old maps of the Atlantic. The choice of a large collection was wise, as many cartographers of the time liberally decorated the still mostly unexplored reaches of the Atlantic Ocean with fabulous islands of their own devising, since most had never actually sailed those waters. By comparing the many different maps, Henry was able to roughly work out which islands were likely fantasy, the ones that appeared on only one or two maps or kept moving around quite significantly, and which were real, the ones that appeared fairly frequently and in roughly the same place. This also helped to work out where these more realistic islands actually were. He determined from this, and reports from sailors, that the island chains we now know as the Canaries and the Madeiras were in fact real. More realistically, this actually fell into two camps. The Canaries everyone knew were definitely real. The Castilians had settlements on 3 of them at the time, and of course they claimed the entire chain as theirs, even if contact and the settlement's actual viability was tenuous at best in the early years. The rest of the islands in the Canaries at this point still had native inhabitants who'd managed to rather successfully fend off any attempted colonization. The Madeira Islands, on the other hand, were roughly known about, but somewhat sporadically encountered. In the latter 1410s, 2 ships under Henry's direction who were taking part in expeditions along the West African coast, more on that later, which at that point was another new obsession of his, had been blown off course by a storm and ended up finding shelter in a harbour on a small island that, on further inspection the following year, turned out to be part of the Madeira chain. Thus, the Madeiras could be relatively easily colonised directly. The Canaries would have to be partially colonised and partially seized if they wanted to fly the Portuguese flag there, but that didn't trouble Henry all that much in principle. Like most Portuguese at the time, he could, in theory, care less what the Castilians thought of his ambitions in their territory, but you'd need a very fine microscope to figure out where that very small mote of concern actually lay. However, it turned out that the locals still occupying the part of the Canaries that weren't under Spanish control also weren't especially enthusiastic about having Portuguese overlords any more than they had been about attempts at establishing Spanish ones, and the 1424 expedition to take over some of these islands went so badly that contemporary chroniclers scarcely mention that it was mounted at all. The idea had been to take the islands that didn't have Spaniards on them in order to gain a base from which to mount attacks on the, presumably, much tougher European settlements. That didn't really work out very well, and it wouldn't be Henry's last attempt on this island chain, but generally later expeditions had very little more success. The Madeiras, on the other hand, proved to be a far more successful set of expeditions. As it turned out, they were completely uninhabited, except for some apparently rather foul-tasting sheep that were found on one island. The climate was good, and unlike Portugal itself, which was then in the throes of another wave of plague, and getting somewhat cramped in terms of room for new farms, settlements, and towns, the new islands offered settlers far more space, clean and healthy living, particularly clean supplies of water which flowed liberally from the interior, and a chance to make an awful lot of money exporting everything from tree resin to serve as cloth dye, to wood, which grew in vast quantities on the main island and actually gave it its name, Madeira, which just means wood in Portuguese, so Wood Island. The climate also proved quite suitable for the growing of wheat in the areas where they'd cut the trees down, which then sold quite well back home as demand for wheat often exceeded supply, And then there would be the gradual introduction of cash crops, such as grapes, which would then be turned into Madeira wine, and lastly, the growing of sugarcane. The nearby smaller island of Porto Santo, the one that had originally been discovered, initially offered similar, if slightly reduced opportunities due to its reduced size, but with a bonus of rich fishing grounds. Unfortunately, the accidental introduction of rabbits, who bred very quickly and turned feral, on an island with no natural predators, soon meant that any attempts at growing any kind of crop was pretty much impossible, as the fluffy pests just ate everything. And so the settlers there had to rely on livestock farming and fishing instead. Madeira thus became quite a commercial success story for Portugal. The timbers from the primeval forests in particular being useful for pretty much everything from large building construction to ship making to the making of bow staves and crossbows, which gave the island an international export market even before the wine and sugar industries were founded. Henry initially kept a close eye on things, although officially the islands fell under the authority of the king. But when King John died in the early 1430s, Henry was able to persuade his brother, who now was king, to effectively make him lord of the islands. With the Canaries continuing to prove to be beyond him, and a firm base established on Madeira, Henry's sponsorship of exploration then sent his ships further out into the Atlantic. Some maps had hinted at a chain of islands, roughly in the northwest direction from the Canaries and Madeiras, roughly west from Portugal, and this was reinforced by stories from sailors who, when trying to head back to Portugal from either Madeira or trading trips to the Canaries, would sometimes sail northwest. This might seem strange, since it's in the exact direction you theoretically didn't want to go, but the predominant winds in the area came from the northeast, so sailing straight back against them was out of the question, even in a caravel. But their new ocean-going caravels could sail across the wind until they got far enough north to pick up other winds coming out of the west that would then take them straight home. Given that the only other alternative was to sail east and then work your way up a very hostile Moroccan coast, the choice of route is fairly obvious. But this meant that sometimes, when those westerlies proved elusive, the sailors ended up sailing far enough out into the Atlantic that they would occasionally spot strange islands before finally getting the winds that they wanted. And thus, over the late 1420s and early 1430s, explorers under Henry's patronage both confirmed and then charted much of the Azores island chain, particularly the eastern and central islands. In the mid-1430s, small flocks and herds of domestic animals, like sheep, were landed in a strategic move that was designed to provide a ready meat supply for eventual settlers, as it was hoped that they would survive and breed in the interim. And in 1439, Henry obtained permission from his brother, who, as we said, was now the king, to mount a full settlement expedition. This, and subsequent settlement attempts, were successful, but everything went at a much slower rate than the settlement of the Madeiras. The Azores were much further away, and were subject to periodic volcanic activity and the related earthquakes, so they were a less popular destination than the already somewhat established Madeira settlements. But eventually a similar economy to the latter developed. Wheat, dye, fish, and eventually sugar would be grown and exported from the Azores. But there was nowhere near as much timber, and the more northern climes made vineyards a somewhat less successful prospect. Nonetheless, the sheer number and size of the islands relative to Madeira made them subject to a rather slow-burn struggle between Henry, who, as sponsor of the expeditions to find and settle them, naturally saw them as falling under his purview, and his elder brothers, who kind of wanted a piece of the action themselves, and were gradually getting less and less comfortable with Henry basically assuming lordship over practically every Portuguese holding that happened to be beyond the mainland shores. His explorers also found another set of islands. These were much further south and off the coast of West Africa, the Cape Verde Islands. Or maybe the Italians found them. That particular argument is still ongoing, and actually started during Henry's lifetime. Those islands, though, aren't of all that much interest here, beyond a quick mention that they existed and were found, as none of them were really settled by any of Henry's expeditions. although they would be shortly after his death. But they do provide a rather neat bridge to look at Henry's other significant involvement in exploration, that of the west coast of Africa. With the attempts to take the Canaries failing time and again, Henry's attention was also diverted south. Only about 100 miles south of the Canaries, at least according to some accounts, lay something called Cape Bojador. Today, on the map, it seems fairly innocuous as a barely discernible bump in the northwest African coast. But back then, it was seen, at least by some, as a near impassable barrier to shipping, which at the time still tried to mostly follow the coastline where at all possible. It was said that beyond this cape, the seas boiled, the air was so hot it would cook a man alive, and the waters were so shallow and the current so strong that no ship could survive the passage anyway. The problem was that somewhere past that cape lay the lucrative gold, trade goods, and slaves on what they termed at the time the Guinea coast, the other end of the trade route that had its northernmost terminus in Ceuta. If ships could reach this area directly, they would bypass the travel time overland as well as the fees and taxes that the Islamic kingdoms imposed on traders en route, and which of course were passed on in terms of costs to the European customers at the other end. Now, the reasons for the stories of the dangers of Cape Bojador had some basis, in fact. The sea, for some miles out from the coast, after Cape Bojador, was actually quite shallow, and this, combined with the Sahara heat, drifting dust, and the spray thrown up from various rocks and reefs that lurked just under the surface, did give the general impression of a shimmering and boiling sea that was legitimately dangerous to navigate in any case. On top of that, large schools of fish from the deeper waters of the Atlantic that fled predators such as tuna by swimming up into the shallows would give an impression, at least to a distant viewer, of bubbling water as the fish thrashed about in the shallows. To aid his expeditions generally, Henry had gathered up large amounts of lore on navigation, as well as the latest in navigational instruments, charts, and the like. He also had a tendency to place squires who were in his direct service as the overall commanders of expedition ships. In his opinion, in situations like these, a lifelong sailor may perhaps be given to overcautiousness out of superstition. In this case, a man named Gil Inez was in charge of the ship that, in 1434, after a few failed attempts, managed to bypass the feared cape by the simple expedient of just sailing up to its northern end, and then heading west out to sea, into the deep ocean, where the sea most assuredly was not boiling, and then doubling back on a southeastern course that brought them ashore on the other side of what turned out to actually be a fairly local marine feature. This somewhat anticlimactic triumph meant that the way was now open for further exploration along the African coast. Once again, some accounts suggest that earlier ships might also have made this voyage, but in any case the one sponsored by Henry was the one that got all the publicity and thus broke the spell of horror that had evidently surrounded the place, at least among some European powers. It's been suggested that the tales of the Cape and the horrible fate that lay beyond it were actually invented and then spread by the Islamic rulers along the coast, specifically to try and prevent Europeans from bypassing their on-land trade networks. At least one account of an earlier passage by a French ship appears to have not heard anything about these terrible dangers, and the craft simply sailed south a little bit out to sea, found a few locals when they came ashore, took them prisoners, and then went back to the Canaries and didn't think much more of it. It's also suggested that perhaps this account was one of the reasons why Henry knew the voyage was possible in the first place. In any case, armed with the knowledge from Captain Inez's voyage, Henry petitioned his older brother in 1443 for a grant of monopoly for navigation, exploration, and trade with the loosely defined Guinea coast. Essentially, at the time, this meant the bit of Africa just south of the Sahara, where trees and greenery gradually reappear, and the continent then starts to tuck in for a long run eastward. At the time, this geography was interpreted as the southern boundary of the African continent, which also gave rise to the hope that by sailing along this supposed southern coastline, ships might rapidly reach northeastern Africa, where, it was said, a great Christian kingdom under the rule of one Prester John was doing constant battle with the Saracens. The exact location of Prester John's kingdom had gradually shifted over the past 4 centuries or so, from its original supposed position in Central Asia, gradually by steps moving southwest to its current supposed location in Ethiopia, mostly as the result of the advent of decidedly unchristian civilizations from Central Asia like the Mongols, which rather evidently meant that there couldn't be any Prester John kingdom in those areas. As well as more proximate trade, opening communication with such a powerful nation would undoubtedly increase the power and prestige of whichever nation happened to establish the route. As it turned out, there was actually a Christian kingdom in northeastern Africa, that of Ethiopia, but any relationship between that and the supposed fabulous 100,000-strong army of Prester John was tenuous at best. Between 1434 and 1443, Henry built on his earlier explorations of the northwest African coast to send successive voyages around the coast of Africa, with their main objectives now being to chart the new coast accurately, as up until then, any part of the African coast south of Cape Portugal was so unknown that even the usually imaginative mapmakers of the 14th century had just left the space blank or drawn a straight line there. They were also tasked with reporting on what sort of lands lay beyond the previous remit of European sailing. But aside from the odd seal colony, many of these early tentative voyages were spent perplexed at the seeming lack of any population. A few traces of humanity, such as an abandoned fishing net, were found, but it seemed like huge portions of the coastline were just empty, or else the population was really good at hide and seek. Pondering this would have to wait for a while, though. Another reason for the delay in asking for the monopoly was that in the late 1430s, Henry had found himself occupied with the idea of expanding the holdings in Ceuta by launching a crusade against the Moroccan kingdom more generally, something he'd been trying to arrange for much of the decade in the background. This led to the 1437 attack on Tangier, which went tremendously badly. After several failed assaults, a massive Moroccan relief army just encircled the attackers who were trying to encircle the city, and then starved them into surrender. It was agreed that Henry and the Portuguese survivors would be allowed to leave, in exchange for the return of Ceuta, with Henry's youngest brother, Fernando, remaining as a hostage until Ceuta was returned. But once the army had left, the Portuguese decided not to honour the rest of the agreement, and poor old Fernando was left as a prisoner of the Moroccans until his death some years later. This debacle seems to have pushed Henry away from most of his more martial ambitions and back towards the maritime world. With the grant of monopoly, further expeditions were sent out around Africa to build on the work of the previous ones, and soon enough signs of actual civilization were discovered. A fortified trade outpost was established, and soon a rather strange and bewildering network of trade began, centred on 4 primary branches. A trade in gold, which was both extracted from rivers and mines, a trade in all manner of exotic goods, from skins and hides to horns, musk, dyes, and various other things like that, and 2 separate trades in slaves. Firstly, the bartering of European goods with the locals for slaves who had in turn been captured by the local tribes and kingdoms in various wars and raids with other groups further inland or further down the coast. And secondly, where such trades weren't available, Portuguese expeditions would sometimes mount their own slave raids on the local inhabitants. Although the increased risk of injury and death, as well as the catching of various new and exotic diseases that were involved in these raids, plus the subsequent understandable reluctance of any who were left over to trade in other goods afterwards, made delegating the actual slave-taking part of the operation to the locals a generally far more attractive prospect, not least because it opened up yet another line in potential trade goods, European weapons, armour and equipment, which the local tribes and kingdoms would then use to attain further superiority over other nearby peoples they didn't like in order to capture even more slaves, both for their own use and for further trade with the Europeans, in addition to the regular slave caravans that arrived from much further afield. Part of the reason for the somewhat shotgun approach to the various forms of trade was that by the late 1440s, the traders that were now showing up in caravels were themselves something of a mixed bunch. Some were still on sponsored expeditions sent by Henry to further their knowledge of the area. Others were entirely privately funded mercantile ventures, and still others were mixed private-public affairs, and all of different scales and capacities. Another reason for the switch from the more militant to the more mercantile ambition in the region was simply the fact that the further along the coast into tropical Africa that the Portuguese went, the less and less they encountered the southern environs of the Islamic powers, and the more and more they discovered large numbers of locals who were simultaneously able to offer trade in large amounts, but also field men in large numbers to counter any attempts at direct military intervention. The sheer scale of these forces more than enough to overcome any theoretical, technological, or firepower advantage that a few dozen troops from a handful of caravels might possess, regardless of the covering fire provided by the cannon aboard their ships. Over time, this direct access to the various trade resources of tropical Africa had a rather marked effect on the northwestern African Islamic kingdoms. Although they would retain a measure of their power, the bypassing of these important trade routes, a source of much of their wealth, marked the start of a sharp decline in their fortunes, as well as the enrichment of Portugal. Although Morocco and Algiers as entities would persist, the forthcoming century would see extreme internal turmoil, multiple changes in rulers, and the start of a gradual shift of these powers towards being more havens of corsairs, later known as the Barbary Pirates, as opposed to significant political entities in and of themselves. Now, having concluded a rather whistle-stop tour of Henry's achievements in the maritime sphere, he died in 1460 with much of what we've just discussed still ongoing, there remains one last issue to address: the existence, or not, of the so-called Sagres School. Traditionally, this is held to have been a school for the advancement of the science of astronomy, nautical instruments, cartography, and navigation, all at a palace owned by Henry at Sagres on the southwestern tip of Portugal. Although long promoted, more recent 20th and 21st century scholarship appears to indicate that the school, as previously described, almost certainly didn't exist, not in the least because, well, that area of land wasn't even granted to Henry by his older brother until quite a bit later in Henry's life, and there seems to be fairly little evidence that he actually did all that much with it even once he'd been granted it. However, where this all seems to have grown from, as most legends do have a kernel of truth in them, is that just up the coast is the town or city, depending on the time period, of Lagos. And this port was the jumping-off point for many of Henry's expeditions. Sagres is a headland beneath which many ships would take shelter, waiting for a change in weather before they ventured south. As we've covered, Henry did collect knowledge, maps, and instruments in order to further his ambitions, along with occasionally collecting experts, and he encouraged so many expeditions, and with an admittedly candid eye as to what was held at the time to be supposed truths about navigation, about how one sailed the seas, that there was probably a twofold development going on. Within Henry's own princely court, there would have been an accumulation of knowledge and materials supervised by a small number of experts, particularly a skilled cartographer or two for examining and codifying the old maps, and codifying the new ones that were brought in by the various expeditions who'd gone surveying. Now, of course, those in charge of subsequent expeditions, many of which were squires raised in Henry's court, would have had access to all these materials and the accumulated knowledge, and it seems that in Lagos itself there was also a rather lively interchange between incoming and outgoing sailors, both those in Henry's service and those who just happened to be passing through. Naturally, this would be something that Henry looked to encourage, since safer, more reliable, and more accurate sailing improved the chances of his own expeditions granting a return on his investment, and the results in his quest to expand Portugal's national and trading borders being successful. And so, over time, this natural exchange of knowledge at Lagos, combined with Henry's own archives from which he equipped his expeditions, meshed in people's memories into some grand, independent scientific school, which, while unfortunately not quite the case, does actually put into perspective just how much Henry actually managed to get done, being responsible for the development of a new ship type, and then its exploitation in taking Portugal from being very much a backwater of the European kingdoms into a fairly wealthy and powerful trading force with a strong maritime presence that would, over time, by exploration and trade, expand its reach across much of the planet. Remember that a little bit in the future, at the time of the Spanish Armada, a great number of the fleet's largest and most powerful ships were actually Portuguese, the country at the time having temporarily fallen into the control of Spain. Thus, while some of the legends surrounding him are just that, Prince Henry of Portugal did leave an indelible mark on the history of European exploration of the world, setting the ball rolling for the European discovery and eventual control of much of the planet in subsequent centuries. Even if he himself doesn't seem to have ever gone much further than the North African coast, and his nickname of Henry the Navigator is most likely a 19th century appellation, his accomplishments are still worthy of recognition in the annals of world history, and perhaps all the more profound when examined from a more realistic standpoint. After all, it turns out he managed to do all of this without a massive school of experts telling him what to do.